Hi, my name is Emily Furman, and this is my presentation on consciousness and non-local intentionality. Before we dive in, let me give a brief overview of my presentation. First, I will provide a summary and a brief overview of my thesis. Second, I will present arguments for the mind-brain identity theory and the materialist conception of consciousness. I will then move on to arguments for intentionality, followed by some objections that recent philosophers have presented. Lastly, I will go more in depth into my thesis and provide case studies to back my philosophical argument. Philosophers since Descartes have questioned the power of the mind as an entity. In this paper, I will present a philosophical argument for the ability of consciousness to actually alter reality. Despite the overwhelming evidence for materialism, this paper works to examine if the mind is more than a set of malleable neurological pathways. I argue that consciousness can advance in purpose beyond what Armstrong calls a self-scanning mechanism in the central nervous system. In René Descartes' Meditations, the British empiricist was able to cast doubt on his body but not the existence of his mind. His subsequent belief in dualism, or the perception that the mind and brain are two separate entities, has long been disregarded in favor of science and mainly due to the problem of interaction. Reductive physicalism, or materialism, is the view that the world is made up of only physical things, including ourselves. Materialists, such as David Armstrong, provide a different explanation of what the mind is, or what it is to do things such as to perceive, believe, or to feel. The mind-brain identity theory perceives the mind from a scientific standpoint and considers it to be solely a physiochemical mechanism. As Armstrong writes, only science leads to consensus. Materialists believe that the mind is the same thing as the brain, just as water is the same thing as H2O. Armstrong argues that the states of the mind, like love or fear, are psychosomatic dispositions. Kant described consciousness, or what the mind looks like from the first perspective, as the inner sense. Armstrong uses Kant's ideas of the mind to define consciousness in a materialist framework. Armstrong writes that the consciousness is the perception of the state of one's own mind. As he puts it, we are not drivers in an automatic state, but instead fully aware of ourselves. However, the premises of materialism and the mind-brain identity theory still leave a lot unanswered. Philosopher David Chambers writes, "There is nothing we know more intimately than the conscious experience, but there is nothing that is harder to explain." Chambers goes on to examine a functionalist explanation and a non-reductive explanation for the various phenomena that materialism fails to explain. In my paper, I will be agreeing with Chambers' ontological argument that there is a fundamental property to consciousness in order to further examine intentionality. Intentionality is what German philosopher Franz Brentano defines as the capacity of the mind to be directed at or to be about objects and states of the world other than the mind itself. In other words, it is an aboutness in mental states. For instance, a desire to see Dallas is about Dallas. A belief that seawater is salty is about seawater. With intentionality, we witness a relationship between our mind's pointer, or representation, and a referent, or target of that representation. John Searle, a contemporary philosopher, adds to the discussion by identifying distinctions of mental states. He writes that mental states, like perceptions and beliefs, have a mind-to-world direction of fit, in that they are supposed to fit how things really are in the world. Searle distinguishes them from desires and intentions, which aren't how the world is, but how we would like it to be, or what we will change it to be, and he calls this a world-to-mind direction of fit. A real-world example would be if I intend to raise my arm or the physical world will change in order to match my intentions. Searle also discusses causation. If you perceive something, then the thing you have witnessed has had to cause your perception of it. However, in the case of intentional action, the intention itself has to be the cause of intention. Thus, perceptions have mind-to-world fit, but world-to-mind direction of causation. This also applies for memories. Meanwhile, plans or intended actions have world-to-mind fit, but mind-to-world causation. I know this can be a little confusing. I'm sorry. I hope the diagram helps. The reason that intentionality is such a complication for the materialist conception of the mind is because it raises the question of how a purely physical state can be about anything. Another issue that intentionality of consciousness raises is that it does not involve any spatial distance or time. To think about Moscow or Beijing is no harder or takes any more time than it does to think about Kansas. We also can have two contradictory thoughts at once if we are not fully aware that they're both in reference to the same object. There is also the issue that we can think about things that simply do not exist. Rachel's offers some responses and objections on behalf of thinkers who are not fully on board with the intentionality of consciousness. The first response he offers is that a physical object can be about something by resembling it. For instance, a picture of Taylor Swift is about Taylor Swift because it looks like her. However, this resemblance is a symmetrical relationship, as Swift represents the picture as much as the picture represents Swift. Also, brain states are not the same thing as pictures. Lastly, we can think about a non-physical thing, such as the square root of -1, and believe in it, but there is no physical state that can represent it. Another argument thinkers offer is that brain states are causally related. For example, seeing Taylor Swift on TV made me think of Taylor Swift. But there are things that we think about all the time that definitely do not exist. Rachel concludes that it does not seem that physical states could be intentional. He supports that whatever mental states are, they are not states of the brain. However, Rachel concludes by stating that there is no decisive victor in this debate about intentionality as of yet. I will now circle back to my thesis and philosophical argument, which is that the world-to-mind fit presented in mental states of desire or intention can to some capacity alter reality. As my premises, I will accept both the idea of consciousness being non-reducive and consciousness being intentional. In addition to supporting these premises, I will also provide case study examples to strengthen my conclusion. One case study I will use is the Wim Hof method. Wim Hof, or as he's popularly known, the Iceman, has developed this method of breathing and meditation techniques that have allowed him and his subjects to manipulate their bodies to withstand extreme conditions. Wim Hof and his students have been reported to consciously raise their own body temperature when faced with extreme cold. There was also another study done in which Wim Hof and his students were injected with E. coli along with a control group, and Wim Hof and his students were able to fight off the infection through mindful breathing and a calm mindset alone. If you have any possible suggestions for other studies that come to mind, please let me know. Thanks for listening.